Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here with Dr. Kipp Davis. I'm very excited to do this episode, but it's also a very heavy subject. And so, before I get into just everything that I'm going to say here, just kind of a disclaimer and opening statement, let me just have Dr. Kipp Davis introduce himself to the audience.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Swan. It's nice to get a chance to meet you. And hello to your audience. My name is Kipp Davis. I am a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I do a lot of my work these days on YouTube and in social media. And I tackle topics uh, predominantly related to countering bad scholarship, and which always seems to encompass bad Christian apologetics.
Mhm. Yeah, and just for the audience who are watching, you might be wondering why am I like 4 feet away and Dr. Kipp Davis has nice lighting, and it's really because I had technical issues. For those who've been keeping up, you'll know that I've been trying to like do things with my laptop. My laptop camera stopped working. Just a bunch of weird things have happened. So
Oh.
I do apologize for like the jarring. Like, okay, I'm 4 feet away, and Dr. Kipp Davis is a very reasonable distance. My apologies for that. So today we're here to talk about the conquest of Canaan, and I think it's going to be a comprehensive introduction, if that's possible, if that's not an oxymoron. And I want to say some things up front for my audience, for those of you who are watching. First off, I know that Dr. Kipp Davis and Josh Bowen have been kind of having a back and forth with Dr. David Falk and Michael Jones, and I just want to say up front that I've only had positive interactions with Dr. David Falk and Michael Jones, and this is not intended on my part to, I don't know, launch a torpedo at them. Rather, because of the seriousness of this topic, the conquest of Canaan, on a moral and spiritual level, I think it's worth talking about it with Dr. Kipp Davis. And also, there are a lot of things that I admire about Kipp Davis. One of them is his moral clarity against slavery and genocide. I think that in these discussions, we just need to be blunt about the moral content of what we're looking at. And so I do respect Kipp a lot for that. And that's why I wanted to have him on the channel. And also because I've seen his work, I've seen his interactions with, or his work with Josh Bowen. And also I like Dr. Bowen. So it's a win-win for me. And obviously, Dr. Kipp Davis and I are not going to agree about everything. I'm Roman Catholic. Dr. Kipp Davis is a former Christian. And I mean, we don't have to agree on everything. We just have to agree on the subject today, I think, um, and the severity of what we're talking about and the seriousness of it. And so, I don't want anyone to think that, oh, Swan is now, I don't know, an atheist or agnostic. No, no, that's not what's going on here. And regardless, as I've said on other streams, Roman Catholics, we don't have to make the same moves as evangelicals and other conservative Protestants. I've seen numerous serious and devout Catholic biblical scholars who have just said, yeah, the conquest didn't happen. And these aren't men and women who are, wishy-washy about the faith. They pray the rosary. They're very serious. They're very devout. They look at the theology and the teachings of the church, and they come to these conclusions not because they aren't devout, but precisely because they're devout and trying to take the text seriously, look at it and study the historical evidence. And I've even had Catholic priests who have told me, yeah, like Swan, what you're saying about slavery in the Bible, we learned about that in seminary. We learned that the Bible doesn't abolish slavery. This was a Catholic priest telling me this, that this is what he learned in his seminary. Or one time I went to a spiritual direction with a very devout, serious Catholic priest, and he said, the conquest of Canaan didn't happen, right? And now some of you might think, okay, these guys are just liberals. And it's like, no, they really aren't. Like the way they practice the liturgy, the way their prayer life, these are men who are, for the priests, these are men who are devout and they are aware of the scholarship and they are serious about the scholarship, the archaeology, the evidence, and they try to practice their faith with the integrity of not denying one or the other, but holding them both together. And so this is why I appreciate the work of Dr. Kipp Davis, because there are times where we as religious people use bad arguments, use bad reasoning, and we need, people like Dr. Josh Bowen, Kipp Davis, or just other scholars to tell us, hey, this really doesn't work. And then we have to, as Catholics, as theologians, come up with better solutions that are that have integrity and work with the scholarship. And of course, if we, there might be points where we can't totally accept the scholarship. It depends on, like, if, for example, we believe that the resurrection happened, whereas a historian might say, I can't establish that. And that's fine, right? We take that on faith. Um, but I just want to say here that I think a lot of the popular methods for dealing with these dark passages in the Bible are inadequate. And I think the first step towards a better theology, towards a better treatment of people with doubts or questions, is to take the problem seriously and look at it squarely in the face. And so I'm sorry, Kipp, that I had to go through all that, but I think it's very important for my audience to know where I'm coming from.
That's a great intro, Swan. And if I could just chime in here a little bit, my interest in the work that I do on YouTube and on social media, my interest is I don't consider it religious.
Mm-hmm.
My interest as I continue to try and remind people is about a a a robust appreciation of the Bible, what it is, where it came from, how to read it, how to understand it, as a fascinating collection of important, really important ancient literature, foundational literature for uh, most of Western culture and Western civilization, which really drives me then to set like a just a very high importance on ensuring that people are understanding these texts correctly. And I'll just say in addition to that, so while I identify now as a former Christian, it certainly wasn't always that way. You talked about interacting with Catholic priests who take critical approaches to the texts and to the history, in particular behind the Old Testament
Mm-hmm.
narratives. I believe. So this is I did my training. My terminal degree is from the University of Manchester, which is a public institution in the UK, but I did my undergrad and my graduate training at an evangelical Christian university just outside of Vancouver, out here on the West Coast where I live, called Trinity Western University. And at this, what many would consider a pretty conservative evangelical Christian school, I was trained in critical biblical scholarship in my graduate program. This is how we read the texts and worked through the text. So I just say that to just really clarify for people that my approach to the text is not, it's not well how I think a number of people would classify as minimalists. It's not even necessarily secular. It's conventional and it's mainstream. This is the direction that biblical scholarship has gone. A field that is dominated, absolutely dominated by people of faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing I just want to point out too that you said, you're not doing your channel and other things because you like despise the Bible and you just want to rip it apart, right? It's because of a robust seriousness towards the text and the weight and the value of it, and even the great beauty that is contained in it in
Yes.
certain parts, right?
It
And
really,
so,
yeah.
mhm,
No, I was just gonna say it starts from a great deep appreciation and love for this. I mean, I didn't dedicate the better part of the last 30 years of my life to reading and studying the Bible because I wanna because I hate it, right? Um, if anything, the fascinating um backstory, I suppose, of the Bible, its collection as or its yeah, its collection of various types of ancient literature, if anything, critical appreciation for the biblical text just increases
Hmm.
my fascination for it and makes me want to know and understand it even more.
Right. And I'll say one more comment, and then we'll get into the interview itself. But you know, as I said before, with your robust seriousness of it, I think one way to honor the text is to look at what's in it. And there are times where I think some people say, "Oh, I want the Bible to be this way for my faith. I need it to be this way and need it to be like clean and all neatly put together and no kind of like dark or difficult passages." And it's kind of like, well, you're not honoring the text at that point. You're not really looking at it. You want something that it is not, right? And so I think that like what we're doing today, and even for religious people throughout history, actually meditating on these dark passages and thinking about how do I deal with them, that's also been a deep part of the spiritual life and forming
Oh,
better theology and forming a better, healthier church community.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's my hope that that's what the work that I do in the public eye contributes to. I you know I My hope is that people who do take these texts seriously confessionally
Mm,
also develop mature and sensibly robust theologies out of them.
right.
I do have some strong feelings though about how exactly we go about doing that.
Mm. Well, this interview is going to be conducted in three sections. The first is we're just going to do direct exegesis of the text. We're going to look at what is contained therein. The second part is going to deal with the issue of historicity. And the last part, which is perhaps the most thorny, well, actually, historicity might be thorny too, will be on ethics. And Dr. Davis, I'm using my phone as my camera. So if it ever dies and it just goes black, I'm still here. Just a heads up. this,
Okay.
this this is a
All right.
bizarre setup. I'm so sorry. Anyway, okay, exegesis. Um, so I want to emphasize the importance of actually reading the texts and confronting what is in them. We sometimes have in our minds, especially as believers, the gist of the story, and it's all kind of cleaned up and simplified. But then there's a moment where you have to just look at what is in the text, what is said about slaves, women, so on and so forth. So, Dr. Davis, how often do you see people who don't really know what's in these texts or are simply in denial?
Oh, it's very common, right? And I think that this is the product of a couple of things. We those of us who attended Sunday school as children, we sang songs about the walls of Jericho falling down.
Mm,
This was a popular um this was a popular theme or a story to tell in Sunday school, which is kind of horrifying when you get down to actually reading the text and actually looking at what this story is, what it's about, right? And we have these tropes that develop, I think, through shows that were popular when my kids were little, like VeggieTales and their retelling of the Battle of Jericho, right? So it's people will invariably see the text through these deeply culturally conditioned lenses. And they also tend to think through the text in terms of modern categories as if this was a straightforward retelling of ancient history,
mm,
when a close reading of the text and a careful appraisal of where it came from and who wrote it and some of the issues that are inherent within the way these stories are told, it really, really confronts this idea in such a way that it becomes difficult to ignore. And I think this is where you get uh, people who are in denial of some of these things. Uh, one of the things that I encounter with some frequency is an effort to handle the text from a strongly historical perspective, operating from the presupposition or at least the allowance of a plausibility that this could record actual historical events. And I think the mistake that's made at the outset is to look at gaps within the text or unspoken features of the text and to depend on these as supporting a potential historicity of of what's told inside. For example, and we'll get to some of this as we go through it, but one of the problems with aligning the retelling of the conquest or the narration of the conquest as it's presented in the book of Joshua and seeing that reflected in the historical and the archaeological record is that there's a huge number of inconsistencies in terms of the sites that are mentioned as being destroyed in the text and actual evidence for the destruction in archaeology. Many of the sites mentioned in the book of Joshua as having been destroyed by the Israelites are just unoccupied at the time of the conquest. A good example of this is the city of Ai, um, which is the second city that the Israelites uh, go to conquer in Joshua chapter 7 and 8. And at the time when conservative readers of the text want to situate these texts, whether it be in the 15th or the 16th century BCE, which is problematic, the 13th century BCE, which is problematic, but perhaps maybe less so. No matter where you want to put it, the city of Ai was unoccupied. It had already 1,000 years at that point. Now, when encountering this reality, one of the reactions I have seen from apologists and from conservative readers who are seeking to maintain an element of the historical reality behind these texts is to say, well, archaeology is not perfect, right?
Mm,
Archaeology can't tell us everything about the sites. There are all sorts of mitigating factors which impede our ability to even interpret the data. Erosion, site leveling, contamination from later periods or in terms of the gathering of the data. So even though it looks like Ai has been abandoned for 1,000 years at the time of the conquest, we can't know that for sure. So there's always this window I find tends to be commonly left open by readers, some readers of the text, as if to say, so long as I can't find anything that outright completely contradicts what's told in the story in the story of the conquest, there's always a chance.
mm,
There's a chance that these elements of the story can fit the archaeological record.
mm,
Um, and it's in my from an historical perspective, that's just not how we do our work.
mm. Yeah, if I can just say one thing really quick, it reminds me of how during my fall semester here at Harvard Divinity School, in my introduction to the New Testament class, one of the professor he said, you can harmonize these texts if you want to, And that if you
Yeah.
want to just kind of rung in my head because it made me think about like, well, yeah, if you really want to, you can always find a way to, make things work or so on and so forth. And at least for me, there's this question about to what extent is that just trying to make something work that's not supposed to, right? And what is the what how can I have the integrity to look at the evidence and say, okay, maybe I'm trying to expect something here that not even the Bible is trying to give me or do. um like for example, we'll get into this in kind of the historicity section, but there are a lot of Catholic apologists like Jimmy Akin and I think Joe Heschmeyer who have both said, yeah, the text isn't intending to be historical in describing the conquest. So I mean,
It's a great
it,
first step.
right, right. So before we get there, though, um, just to now frame what we're talking about more closely, what is the conquest of Canaan, and where would we find it in the Old Testament canon?
So the story of the conquest of Canaan is predominantly found within the book of Joshua, which is the sixth book of the Old Testament, following right on the heels of the end of the Pentateuch or the Torah in the book of Deuteronomy. Some of what is set in the book of Joshua is presumed by the closing chapters in the book of Deuteronomy. And
Mm-hmm.
just to set the scene, the Israel at the in the book of Deuteronomy has been wandering through the wilderness for the last 40 years and finally come to the eastern shores of the River Jordan, and are preparing to enter into the land of Canaan when Moses delivers to them this lengthy collection of speeches and rules, which is what the book of Deuteronomy essentially is. As part of this, he also recounts these two Amorite cities, Sihon and Edrei, which are on the eastern side of the Jordan, and they fight battles against them, and we're told that they destroy these two so-called Amorite cities, and that several of the Israelites actually start to occupy them, and then they prepare to cross the Jordan, enter the land of Canaan, and to basically overrun the Canaanite residents and to occupy the land of Canaan. And Moses provides instructions for this in the book of Deuteronomy, and he tells the people, you're to go into the land, you're to slay all the inhabitants of all these cities. You're not to leave anyone left. You're not to leave anyone alive. You have to kill everyone. Everyone has been set apart as a special a special devotion to Yahweh. The specific word there is herem. It's a noun derived from the verb haram, which and we'll talk about this in a little bit. But
Mm-hmm.
this idea that the land needs to be completely emptied and cleansed of all the iniquity that has been accumulating over the hundreds of years of Canaanite settlement. So this is the story of the book of Joshua. The Israelites enter the land, and they basically uh, rout all the residents, starting in the southern part of Canaan, and then into northern Canaan all the way up to the city of Chatzor, which is just north of the Kinneret, or the Sea of Galilee. And then the second part of the book of Joshua basically lays out the allotments of territory for all the um, the the people of Israel. Now, I think it's important to mention um, one other thing here. This is a tradition. This idea of the Israelites entering the land and conquering the people who were there and taking possession of it. This is actually quite an old tradition.
Mm-hmm.
We see it. The Book of Joshua itself is not a text that plays a big role for other writers of the Old Testament. You don't see much interaction with the Book of Joshua by the Hebrew prophets. Not until, yeah, it plays a role in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which were dated, were written no earlier than the Persian period. But we do see some echoes of this early tradition, most particularly in one of the oldest texts of the Bible, known as uh, the Song of the Sea. I think it's also called the Song of Midian, and that appears in Exodus chapter 14. Let me actually just pull up
Mm-hmm.
a a translation of this, and I can so this is one of the earliest text scholars, biblical scholars, agree that this is probably one of the earliest texts in the entire Hebrew Bible. Some scholars have dated it as early as like the 11th or maybe even the 12th century BCE. I don't think it's quite that old, but still, it's very old. It's one of our earliest traditions, and towards the end of the song, which appears in Exodus 15, it says this about Israel's entry into Canaan. It says, "In your strength, speaking of Yahweh, in your strength you escort him," speaking of Israel, "to your holy pasture. The peoples hear, they tremble. Agony grips the residents in Philistia." These are the people who lived along the southern coast of Canaan and what is predominantly modern day Gaza. "Now are the chiefs of Edom horrified." These are the people living to the south of the Dead Sea, close to the Sinai. "The rulers of Moab, trembling, will seize him." Moab is located to the southeast. It's on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea in sort of the Transjordan area there. It goes on to say, "All the dwellers in Canaan have melted. Terror and dread are falling upon them. Dread, by your strong arm, they are still as stone until your people advance, Yahweh. Until your people advance, those whom you acquired. You will bring him and plant him on the mountain of your heritage, the place you made your abode, Yahweh, the sanctuary, my Lord, which your hands established. Yahweh, you will reign forever and ever." So that's a this is the I think it's fair to say that the book of Joshua is a lengthy narratological retelling of what's being described
Mm-hmm.
in this part of this extremely ancient tradition. Um, Now I think there are probably also lots of other traditions that are included in the Book of Joshua. The actual composition of the Book of Joshua is a complex matter. Most scholars today are of the opinion that it's a compilation of a variety of different older traditions, and set in this way for various religious and political reasons. Um, but I guess just to summarize all that,
Mm-hmm.
this is what the story is. This is where you find it. It's an old story, but it's one that has been dramatically redacted, edited, rewritten for later audiences.
And what would we call the kind of violence that happens before Joshua's conquest with Moses in the wilderness and Midian? I mean, would that fall under I mean, I don't think it would fall under the conquest of Canaan. What would we just call that period, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that would be, and the way it's framed, the Book of Deuteronomy, and some of this appears in the Book of Numbers as well. You'll notice if you read these stories, the way they're framed, are in terms of the Israelites just needing passage through these territories in order to get to the land of Canaan. So, they approach Edom, and Edom says, no, you can't pass through our territory. So they have to go around, which is actually how they end up on the eastern side of the Transjordan, seeking access from much farther north into the territory, and are ultimately, because they're rebuffed there, they need to fight with
Mm,
these so-called Amorites. The way it's presented in the text is these are wars predominantly of necessity. There's
mm,
also some important encounters that they have with the Midianites and the Amalekites. The Midianites who I believe it's numbers
31.
21 through,
Oh,
or is it
yeah,
31? Yeah, no.
yeah.
It could be. I'll get some of this mixed up because it's not fresh
It's a lot of
on my
information.
mind. It is. And the way it all fits together is really complicated too,
Uh-huh.
right? So, but there's stories about yeah, so the for example, the Moabites in Numbers 22 through 24 are terrified by the encroaching Israelites. So they um join in with the Midianites to lead the Israelites astray in an effort to uh, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess to obstruct, to uh, interfere with their efforts of going through their territory. The Amalekites are depicted throughout the biblical texts as perhaps the worst of all the people. And this because they very cravenly wouldn't meet them face to face on the battlefield, but attempted, to weaken them by picking off the widows and the
Mm,
children in the back and the old people. Just this very cowardly, detestable action. So, the throughout the wilderness period, the conflicts that the Israelites have, I would say, are more of necessity. They're just trying to get to the land, to the promised
mm,
land. So it's different in that regard. But much of the way that the language, um much of the way that the texts are written, the language that is used is very similar. I guess the circumstances are a bit different.
yeah. And so what you're saying is that there's this wilderness period, and then once we get into the conquest of Canaan, the combat is no longer just of necessity, but it takes on this new meaning, which we have
Yes.
talked about, which is Herem warfare. So talk to me about
Yes.
that.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a number of different words that are used in the book of Joshua in particular to describe the actual destruction of these places, of these of these cities in Canaan. You've got words like shamad, which means to obliterate or to annihilate. Harag, which just means to kill or to slaughter. Saraf and Yatzat are words used meaning to burn or to ignite. Uh, Far and away the most common term that appears in the text is nakah, which in the Old King James, this is the word that was translated as to smite,
Hmm.
uh, to strike, to kill. These are all acceptable translations. The one word that I think is particularly important to this story is the one I mentioned already, and that's the verb haram. The nominal form is herem, and this is often translated in English as to utterly destroy or to completely annihilate. Frequently, when the noun is used, uh, Yahweh says that he has put a ban or has devoted these particular people or these particular places to himself. So, an evangelical scholar by the name of John Walton has defined Herem as to remove something from human use. He's depending a little bit on Jacob Milgrom, who's written probably the most extensive commentary on the book of Leviticus. So he's depending on him a little bit for this definition, and he argues that Herem on its own does not mean to utterly destroy in its
Mm.
most basic sense. It means to prohibit the object of the verb from human activity. Now, I think he's right, and what's really important here to note, I think he's right to recognize the really critical cultic implications in this term. The verb appears with tremendous frequency throughout the book of Joshua to describe this utter annihilation of all the people and all these cities which were set aside to Yahweh as Herem. When I work through these texts, I call these Herem offerings. Uh, in my estimation, these are places of special sacramental devotion to Yahweh. It's really, really important to understand the cultic context of this. You'll recall I said early on that one of the reasons for the need to wipe everyone out and to remove the people from the land to which Israel is entering is because it's polluted,
Mhm.
it's impure. And Herem very much is part of this purification process. In order to make the territory inhabitable for Yahweh, who is entering the land with the people as their God, it needs to be purified. His divine presence can't handle the it can't handle in impurities. And this is really a prevalent theme throughout the book of Leviticus, which is, the other text where we see this verb used with some frequency. So, first and foremost, I really think it's very important to communicate to everyone just the sacramental nature
Mhm.
of what's going on here. And this is, I think, why a lot of people will describe what happens in the book of Joshua as a sort of holy war. It's very much about religious devotion and religious themes. The other element that's important to think through here is the nature of the kind of sacramental offering that Herem is and why it is the way it is. Within an ancient Near Eastern context, just very broadly speaking, in its earliest stages, the whole idea of sacrifice, the sacrifice of which is basically just the immolation, the slaughter and immolation of animals, the destruction or the burning of food, the pouring out of wine or juice, these sorts of things. The general idea behind this was about feeding the gods. This is how the gods were sustained. This is how they obtained food or elements the natural world. Getting things from the natural world into the divine realm took place through their destruction. And this kind of, you can see how this kind of makes some sense within an ancient worldview whereby, death becomes sort of your entry into this other place,
Mhm.
this cosmic realm. Uh, so by extension, this is how sacrifices functioned. These were gifts for the gods, and in order to get them to the gods, they had to be destroyed or to be killed. Now, understanding what Herem is in these terms starts to make some sense about why it was necessary to kill everyone and to destroy everything. Because Yahweh has set apart all the objects of Herem for himself. These are special offerings for him, for his enjoyment, for his sustenance, which means that they have to be annihilated. They have to be destroyed. If it's people or animals, you have to kill them. If it's cities, you have to burn them or break them down. Um, this is just how this works within an ancient Near Eastern, what I call an ancient Near Eastern economy of sacrifice. Now, I'll say one more thing here about how to understand this idea of Herem, particularly as it's presented within the biblical texts. We see it used with frequency in the book of Joshua. There's another text which describes a Herem campaign in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Saul is instructed by Yahweh through the prophet Samuel to go and finally wipe out those cowardly Amalekites. And the way Yahweh instructs him there is to offer everything up as a Herem to me. Don't let anything live. Everything has to be killed. Now, the stories about Herem in the Bible, there's that one in 1 Samuel chapter 15. There's the other important one in Joshua chapter 6 and 7, which describes the destruction of the city of Jericho. As a Herem offering, everything is devoted to Yahweh. All the animals and all the people, by that measure, are to be slaughtered. Everything is to be destroyed or saved for specific use in Yahweh's sanctuary, which is supposed to be the tabernacle at this point. Those familiar with the story will remember that one of the Israelite warriors by the name of Achan decides to hold back a little bit of the plunder. He keeps some silver and a robe for himself, thus violating the Herem. This is the other idea behind the Herem. The Herem is a form of extreme devotion. Under ordinary circumstances, when ancient Near Eastern peoples went to war, one of the reasons for that was to enrich your king, to enrich your nation, to enrich yourselves. Soldiers would go and fight in the forces of a king in exchange for the promise of plunder. They would be able to take back things after conquering the people who owned them. That's how they, increased their holdings of sheep and cattle and slaves and other material goods too. So within a Herem warfare, when I say this is a form of extreme devotion, what I mean by that is that there's no opportunity for plunder.
Mm-hmm.
So when soldiers are instructed to kill everything and to destroy everything, what this means is you're going into this battle and there's going to be no enrichment for yourselves. All of it is mine, speaking as the God here. And in so doing, you are making a demonstration of your unflinching devotion to me and to what I want. So the stories, these two stories in particular about Herem in Joshua chapter 6, 7, and 8, and then in 1 Samuel 15, they focus on the failure of Achan in the first one and then Saul in the second one to fulfill instructions of extreme devotion. They hold stuff back. Achan kept stuff back from Yahweh in this Herem offering. Saul kept back the best of the flocks and the cattle, and he kept the king of Amalek alive in 1 Samuel 15. So it's very clear within the biblical text that when it talks about making Herem offerings, it's very, very important that these are total, that you don't ever hold these back from Yahweh, and you do so at the risk of your own life and your own destruction. This is what happens to Achan.
Yeah. And
Not
his
just him,
family. Yeah.
his entire family is killed and burned as a result of him holding back a little bit of the silver and a tunic. And Saul, uh, in one of the there's like three stories in First Samuel about why
Mm.
Saul's kingdom, uh, why Yahweh abandoned Saul and his kingdom fell, and this is one of them. It's because he held back some of the Herem. He wasn't completely devoted to Yahweh. And I think it's really important to emphasize that within the biblical narrative, the Herem is viewed, I think, as a fearsome thing. I would say a dreadful thing in terms of just uh the 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 extremity of the devotion that's required of its adherents, but it's also a good thing. Demonstrations of this kind of devotion to Yahweh are commendable.
Mm.
There's a tension involved here, I think, where the recognition on the part of the writer and the readers is that this is what was required for the cleansing of the entire territory, this type of extreme devotion. But I think there's also some recognition there that this is something that maybe nobody can actually do.
Mm.
Sorry, I
And
rambled on there
no, you're
for,
good.
for a while.
When you talk about the sacramental character of the bloodshed and the
Mm.
destruction that we're looking at, is it fair to say that when they go in and kill women and children and non-combatants and even the soldiers, it's all one massive human sacrifice to the God of Israel?
I, I think that's the idea,
Yeah.
right? And so the Southern Campaign appears in Joshua chapter 10. And I'll just quickly summarize everything going on there. Um, there are 7 cities in the south that are specifically offered up as Herem to Yahweh. Jericho in chapter 6, Ai in chapter 8, then Makkedah, Eglon, Lachish, Hebron, and Debir. So here's the way these are described. The city of Jericho, it says that the people made a Herem offering of everything in the city, from man to woman, boy to old man, including cattle, sheep, and donkeys, and they did so with the sword. That's my translation.
Mhm.
Uh, when it describes the destruction of Makkedah, it says he made a Herem offering of them, speaking of Israel collectively, every living thing that was in it. Of Eglon, it says every living thing that was in it on that day, he made a Herem offering like everything he did to Lachish. Of Hebron, it says he struck it with the sword, its king, its towns, and every living thing that was in it. He did not let any survive, just like he did with Eglon. And he made a Herem offering of it and every living thing in it. Of Debir, it says they made a Herem offering of every living thing that was in it. He did not let anything survive, just like he did with Hebron. Do you see a pattern
Mhm.
here? Like it's I think the text is abundantly clear that it's about the totality. I've called it in other places indiscriminate killing.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is you're not just intent on killing soldiers, right? You're indiscriminately killing everything from soldiers to aristocrats to city residents to old men to children to cows to sheep. The, over and over and over again, the point made within these texts is that everything that lives needs to be killed in order for this to be effective.
One popular response, though, Dr. Davis, is that no, I mean, it's not indiscriminate killing. It's just the order was to drive the people out of the land. Some people will say, okay, look, it says kill everybody here, and then next thing you know, down the line, you see they're still around, right?
Yes.
Hence, the order was really to drive them out. And we can get into like ancient warfare rhetoric, that response too. But let me just focus on this one here. Is it indiscriminate killing? Is it drive them out of the land? What's going on when the text seems to support both?
So this is part of the problem of the very complex nature of the composition of the Book of Joshua. I think you've got a melding, an amalgamation of a variety of different traditions because there is this inconsistency inherent within the texts. Um, so I can't really get into that because it's a
Sure.
hugely complicated issue. There's a commentary, Dozman's commentary on the Book of Joshua, I think was published um a few years back, 2015. It's almost 10 years old now, but it's really the most recent helpful one. He spends the better part of 30 or 40 pages just discussing the compositional problems with the Book of Joshua and where scholarship tends to be today. And where scholarship has landed today is on this idea that the reason you see some of this inconsistency within the text is because it's been compiled from a variety of different sources. Now,
Hmm.
Paul Copan and a number of Christian apologists are going to take a more univocal approach to the text in an effort to see how all this stuff could possibly fit together. And they arrive at that by suggesting that this is much of this is just ancient warfare, hyperbolic rhetoric. We see similar things in other ancient Near Eastern texts when describing the destruction or the conquering of a foreigner or an enemy. Texts from Egypt and from Assyria and Anatolia will often describe their opposition, their opposing combatants as having been completely wiped out, and yet we know from the historical record that that wasn't actually true. So I think there's a couple of important things to say here. I would say I could accept that as an explanation, if not for the great pains that the text itself goes
Hmm.
to communicate to the reader that the whole point behind a Herem offering is its totality. Like, I think within the text itself, when you read these descriptions about how everything alive had to be killed, and then when they left, when this was not fulfilled, major problems ensued within the spirit of the text themselves. I think it's very difficult to hold to this idea that this is just a rhetorical strategy or it's just hyperbolic. And then I'll say, even if it is, um, therefore what? Like, I think it's the other thing we need to point out here is that genocide is hard. It's tremendously difficult, history tells us, to undertake a a mass slaughter or an ethnic cleansing of that nature, or to commit uh an entire group of people or an entire city to total destruction. It's just incredibly difficult. People are going to run away. Uh, under those circumstances, there's going to be lots of people who do get away. Not the 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 Nazis were not even 50% successful in their efforts to systematically uh, annihilate the entire European Jewish population, and yet we still classify that as a genocide. Um, I think if you look at any of these horrific mass killings throughout modern history that we classify as genocides, none of them are total.
Mm.
But the intention's there, right? I think we make this description with regards to the motivations of the combatants, and in this case, with an eye to what the authors intended and what the readers understood. So when they're looking at these descriptions of total destruction, they're not thinking, "Oh, sure, but a few of them got away." They're thinking, "Yeah, everyone died." And I'll just reiterate, even if a few people did get away, even if half the people managed to escape this fate, I don't see how that helps to rehabilitate um, the position
Right.
that this is somehow um, acceptable. I'm not
Mm.
even sure, or even historically
Mm.
more accurate.
Another thought I had too was I remember Gavin in his video dealing with the conquest of Canaan mentioned, how we talk about in our modern day speech. What is it like? Oh, we totally slaughtered them, or we destroyed the other team. But I'm like, sure, like those are very small, concentrated within our climate. Like we can understand what that person means. But if somebody starts saying things like, yeah, and I went to his house and I burned it down, I killed his wife and his children, we'd kind of like, dude, what are you doing? Like, even if it is just rhetoric and hyperbole, it's getting into such a problematic territory
Yeah, it
that
is.
you just can't like say, oh, it's hyperbole though. Like, it's okay. It's like, well, no, even those words are still really problematic, even if they're just hyperbole.
One of the problems I have with and Paul Copan has done similar things as this in particular with regards to his discussions of slavery, attempting to compare the language used within the Bible to describe slavery similar to how we describe uh um transactions of players between sports teams. These are super I think these modern analogies are super problematic on another. I mean, never mind the just the I think the ethical quandary that you kind of get yourself into when you advocate for this sort of thing. Just from a perspective of the function and the development of language.
Mm,
Languages evolve over time and they change. And something that I don't think apologists who make these sorts of arguments spend enough time thinking through are just how these sports metaphors developed in the first place,
mm,
right? Like the idea of slaughtering the other team or wiping the floor with them or annihilating them. This is language that developed out of ancient, more older forms of
mm,
combat. So the meanings of the words at that point have clearly taken on a different meaning, right? Our idea of winners and losers now in the modern world has developed far beyond ideas about this in older periods of time and in antiquity. And then to take modern conceptions of that and attempt to uh I guess lay those over what's going on in these ancient texts is a big mistake because
mm.
they don't know anything about sports in the ancient Near East, right? or about these sorts of contests outside of this military context.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's kind of, well, it's almost deliberately anachronistic, right? I mean,
Yes.
or
Yes.
intrinsically, even if it's not intended. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, totally.